You are welcome to lecture 4 under literature 401, studies in fiction. We are going to continue with our discussion on theoretical approaches to fiction. In this series, it is expected of you to be able to explain the theory we are going to discuss in this series, and that is reader response theoretical approach. You are also expected to give detailed explanation on the key concepts of the theory. It is also expected of you that you are able to differentiate between the approach and other approaches to studies in fiction. Now, let's look at the theory for this lecture, the theory we are looking at, and that is reader response theory. This theory is a response to formalism theory. Don't forget that in formalism theory, it's established that emphasis is on the internal structure of the text. Ideas about the author or ideas about the reader do not count when it comes to analyzing a text. However, in the case of reader response theory, attention is given to the reader as the interpreter and meaning maker of the literary work. So here the argument is that the reader is expected to should be given an active role in the interpretation of the text. So the reader is allowed to bring into the reading, into the analysis, his personal experiences, his beliefs, his cultural backgrounds while interpreting the text. So the interpretation is shaped by the understanding and response of the reader. It's not the text that determines the interpretation. It is not the author that determines the interpretation, but the reader. The reader has the power to give the interpretation or give interpretations to what he has read based on his personal experience, based on what he has read before, based on what he knows, based on his beliefs, his cultural background. All these are what will be determined when meaning is going to be given to a work of narrative. So the reader is in the center of whatever is going to be done as far as interpreting a text is concerned. There are concepts, key concepts and principles that we need to consider when we adopt reader response theory to the interpretation or analysis of the text. The first one there is active reader. If a reader is going to analyze something based or a text based on his or her experience, that reader needs to be an active participant in the reading process. It's not just reading for the sake of reading, it's reading between the lines. And while doing that, he or she brings into the reading his or her own perspectives, feelings, emotions into the interpretation, into the identification of the meanings that are meant to be generated from what is being read. So there is an interaction between the reader and the text. The text is not, as it were, interpreted outside the reader's experience. So there is a total rejection to the notion that the reader is passive in the interpretation of the text. So the intention of the reader or the intention of the author is determined by the reader. Whatever the author might have said that he or she means, that is from his own perspective. It is what the person who has read the work sees as the intention that is more important, not whatever the author claims to be his or her intention. The intention for reading or for the interpretation or that the work carries is determined by the reader. That's why it is not acceptable to say that for a writer or an author to say that he is quoted out of context. The context for interpretation is meant to be controlled by the reader and not by the author. The author is outside, is not involved, his position is not considered. Rather, it is the position of the reader that is germane to the interpretation of a text. The second thing among the principles that we can find under the reader response approach is subjectivity and interpretation. So, since the interpretation is not determined by the text or what people will see in the text, but the reader, the interpretation is subjective. Different readers may have varied responses to the same text based on their individual backgrounds, cultures, and personal experiences. What I feel is the meaning is what I take to be the meaning based on my experience, based on what I have heard, based on what I know. That's what will determine. It is on the basis of that my interpretation of what I have read will be determined. Therefore, this perspective highlights the idea that there are multiple valid interpretations. So, the interpretation is not a one-way interpretation. It is according to the number of the interpreters and their experiences. So, as many interpreters and their experiences are, as many will be the number of interpretations we are going to have. It's not is not limited to the author's position or the text itself, but it has to do, the interpretation given to a text has to do with the angle from which each reader has considered the interpretation or the text to mean. Another principle under this approach is implied reader. In this case, theorists or analysts under implied reader consider the concept of the implied reader to be hypothetical reader. That means that the reader is an idealized figure who possesses the cultural, historical, and literary knowledge necessary to understand and appreciate the text as intended by the author. What do you imply? What are you trying to say? When you have said something, the person listening to you will look at the elements available, factors surrounding what you have said, and then conclude, infer what that may mean to him or her. So when we talk about implied reader, it is the work of the reader to work out the meaning of what is being read based on the available factors, based on the information that he or she has as far as the text is concerned. So the intention of the author is controlled by the cultural, historical, literary, and whatsoever knowledge of the reader. So it is the way the reader aligns with what is read that will determine the meaning the reader is going to have. So the position of the author is not what determines the meaning. What the work contains is not actually the determining factor for the interpretation, but what the reader interprets, the information that the reader can bring out from what he or she has read based on the knowledge he or she has heard, either from a cultural, historical, or literary perspective. We have transactional model still under reader response theory, which adopts the idea that meaning is constructed through the dynamic interaction between the reader and the text. So the reader is transacting between him or herself and the text, not between him or herself and the author. There is a kind of relationship between what is read and the person who has read it. So there is a reciprocal relationship between the reader's interpretations, emotions, and experiences, and the textual cues and structures that shape their understanding. The way words are put together will determine the interpretation the interpreter, the reader will give to what he or she has read. So the reader makes use of the information provided to arrive at a conclusion. And while doing that, that means that there is a transaction between the reader and the text. The last one, the last aspect of among the principles guiding interpretation of the text from reader response theoretical standpoint is intertextuality. There is an interaction between the text or a text and other text. So to interpret a text, we need other text within the text, within the whole text to interpret it. So no text is interpreted as a single text. So the interpretation that is given to a particular text is the interaction between that text and other texts within the whole book that the reader has been able to put together based on his or her previous experience. So there is emphasis on familiarity with other literary works. If Mr. A has been reading African works, his interpretation of another African work will be based on what he has read before, the knowledge he has had before as far as African text is concerned. In the same vein, when one is interpreting a particular text, a particular fictional work, the text within that book will interact with other texts for the reader to come out with his or her own interpretation. Therefore, there is need for cultural references, social discourses for the interpretation of what is read in a text. So the reader capitalizes on his or her past experiences, makes references to the knowledge he or she has gathered, social relationship, before coming to interpret a particular text. And even the text, a particular text is not interpreted as a solitary text, but it is interpreted as a text that has some interaction with some other text based on the experience of the reader, past experience of the reader. Here we have looked at reader response theory, and emphasis has been on the fact that the interpreter of the text is actually the reader. The work of interpreting a text to mean what it's supposed to mean is given to the reader based on his or her past experiences or prior knowledge. And this also has some connection with the interaction between one text and another. So the interpreter or the reader is the determining factor for the interpretation of the text based on the interaction between the text and some other text that make up a whole literary work. So we have come to the end of lecture 4. As usual, go through the questions you that are attached to this lecture. In case you are not sure of answers to the questions, go through the presentation as many times as possible before you go back to the questions. By doing that, you will have been familiar enough to provide correct answers to the questions. Once again, you are sincerely appreciated for the time you have spent to listen to the lecture. Till we meet again, thank you very much.